Joe. Joe was speaking spent a few years at Oxford, and as a result, Joe's formed the impression that the best PhD students in the world come from Oxford. It's based on this sample of one. Then Professor Kanbur has been taught at Warwick University, now Professor at Cornell. He has a very distinguished and eventful career at the World Bank, where with the ease with which, I mean, there are often the two brands of people in the World Bank. There's the operational staff who are managers, people who actually work in the field, and there's the whole research staff, analytical work is done by. Now, nobody is more seamlessly between these two worlds of the World Bank than Ravi Kanbur. He was editor of the World Bank Economic Journal, and so he had a major contribution to the research side. Then, quite remarkably, became chief economist also of the Africa region. He was also the director of the World Bank from Ghana, where he actually lived in Ghana and really did kind of great operational work and wrote about it too. His work is very extensive, and I guess you're all kind of familiar, but not so familiar with Ravi Kanbur. His contributions are so many in so many ways, and he's been very kindly coming very regularly to the postgraduate workshop. Ravi has been one of our regulars, so to speak, an old friend of AGW. It was quite a story which I don't know, I put Ravi on the spot. Ravi is also appointed as the first K. and Raj Fellow of the Reserve Bank of India. Reserve Bank of India recently started a fellowship in honor of the name of K. and Raj, one of India's kind of those who may not know him. What one might call foundational economists, one of these people who were a major, larger-than-life figure in the early days of Indian independence and planning. And he set up an institute in Canada, which was the famous K. and Raj model, which is part of the Indian planning. It was Indian planning. In fact, there was a Raj and Sen model of planning and so forth. So Sen was K. and Raj was a major figure and a guru for many Indian economists of the generation. Now, that's why the Reserve Bank instituted this fellowship, and Ravi is the first recipient, which is particularly nice for him for reasons that Ravi would probably want to tell you himself. And also, there's a colorful episode when Ravi stood up to the entire world, in particular the US Treasury, on a matter of principle, and refused to make certain changes which were demanded of him in a World Bank World Development Report. I won't go into the details again, I'll leave it to Ravi to tell you, but I'm sure many of you heard of the episode, and was greatly admired for his very principled stand. So not many people leave institutions on those kinds of principles. Not only did Ravi refused to, but he actually left, because then he went back to the World Bank. He went back and now the best of friends. Thanks, Ravi.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Of course, we're very good friends. So, well, it's really great to. Oh, you want me to put that on? It's always great to be at the new incarnation. Last year, I gave a talk which was perhaps more conventionally narrowly economic. It was on informality and so on, and regulations and informality, and how enterprises react to regulation, and how we would measure it, and combining the annual survey of industries with the NSSO, and so on and so forth. So, narrowly technical in that sense, but nevertheless, I hope you'll find it interesting. Last couple of years, I've been involved in a down and dirty case, and it's to do with the country in which we're in. It's to do with IDA and India. The question is, should IDA continue, or should India continue to receive IDA, even though it has now crossed the threshold for eligibility for IDA? Its income is now so high that it is above the traditional cutoff. And that's been you can imagine, quite an interesting sort of political debate. What view does China take of it? What view does whatever, and so on. But in being engaged in this sort of down and dirty policy and negotiations aspect of it, then I've come across a very interesting analytical issue, and that's really what I want to focus on today in this talk. What analytical issues arise out of the political question of whether India should continue as a recipient of IDA or not. So let me explain what the background to this thing is. That's the outline of the paper. There are some papers. These are the papers that are on my website from which this presentation is drawn. You can go to my website and you can download all those papers. So here are some sort of political optics. Okay, let me start with that. As most of you will know, the MIG threshold, the middle income country threshold, MIC is middle income country, the MIG threshold is a gross national income of $5,000 per capita. The threshold for losing IDA eligibility is about $1,200 per capita. I'm going to use MIG and IDA interchangeably, but there's some technical differences between the two. And the point is that many countries have recently crossed or are about to cross these two thresholds. The fast period of growth of the late 90s to the mid-2000s has really pushed many countries very close to these thresholds. And India is one such country. Its GNP is now 1,500, so it has actually crossed both thresholds. It has crossed the MIG threshold, according to which actually it loses some UN level support, and it has crossed the IDA threshold, according to which it should lose IDA support as well. The point is that these two thresholds are key indicators in the international development assistance architecture. That's how these things work. They say, below this per capita income level, certain things happen. Above it, certain other things happen. That's how the architecture is structured in that way. And you talk about graduation from IDA. Countries graduate from IDA. Thank you very much. And the big debates on whether aid should continue beyond these thresholds. And the debates are particularly lively on aid to India. So continuing with the political optics, here are some northern taxpayer perspectives on continuing aid to India. And since I spend a lot of time in Britain, I'm very sensitive to the British perspective on this thing. Well, here's what they say. India is now a MIC. It's a nuclear power. It has a space program. Its business leaders are buying up our factories. And, horror of horrors, India has its own aid program. In fact, it's just pledged $5 billion aid to Africa. Okay? Why can't they help their own poor? Okay? Which to me is an interesting question. It's a political optic, very sharply defined. And the title of my talk is, Can a Country be a Donor and a Recipient of Aid? See, all these other things, northern goody-goody types can sort of live with. Okay? The northern NGO do-gooder type can sort of live with. Yeah, they have a space program, but that's because the government is bad. Okay? So we have to help the poor. But the fact that India has its own aid program is the one that simply does not compute. Okay? How can they be giving money to help somebody else's poor, and then you come to me to help their poor? That inconsistency has a tremendous bite in the political debate. The question is, does it have a bite in the analytical debate or not? Hence the question in the title of my paper. The paper and the presentation you'll see is much broader than the title, but I take the title from this thing because it's that second to last bullet which really stands out in the political debates in the North. Well, that's so far as the northern optic is concerned. What about the Indian political optic on this? Well, again, I've been interacting quite closely on this with the Indian Ministry of Finance and so on, and I would say that there are three factions in the Indian policymaking elite, in this sort of the IS types who work in the Ministry of Finance and that sort of arena. So here's the first faction is, we're big boys now, okay? We're G20, we bestride the world like a colossus, okay? We are looking for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. It's rather demeaning for us to go cap in hand to ask for support from the concessional window of the World Bank. We've made it now. Yeah, thank you, we're mixed now, thank you very much. Okay? The second faction is, India is a MIC, true, But it is our shame that we have 400 million poor people. It is our shame that we have 400 million poor people. So, almost by definition, we're not able to do anything about it because it exists, despite the fact that we've now crossed, if you like, the poverty line on average. These are all using, we can get into the technical discussion of measurement of poverty and so on. This is not the place to do that. I'm happy to do that in the question and answer part of it, okay? And if resources are available, yeah, we should access them. The third faction, which is probably the majority, are the sort of pragmatic types. And a lot of them in the IAS, they say, you know, if there's a couple of $1 billion on the table, concessional, and we can access it without doing too much damage to our geopolitical thing, why not? Why not? Why do you want to play this grand thing on the first bullet and lose a couple of $1 billion? Okay? And of course, this argument has more weight in financially difficult times, which is what we have now, okay? Which is what we didn't have 5 years ago in the Indian context, when it was go-go, growth at 10%, all that sort of stuff. So you'll see how these, and I'll come to how these different factions have moved and shifted in power and so on over the last few years later on when I develop this argument further. Of course, the ultimate resolution of all this is going to be in the political arena, okay? But what I want to do here is to look at this from an analytical perspective, and I want to ask 3 questions. Firstly, how is the moral responsibility to help a poor person mediated by the nature of the nation state in which that person lives? Is it independent of that, or is it unconditional? Second, suppose there was indeed equal moral responsibility to help the poor in the world, no matter which country they lived in. Is it a rational outcome for a country to be a recipient and a donor of aid? Can we think of an economic model in which that could be an equilibrium outcome? And third is a more operational question, still technical question. Should the World Bank concessional assistance window IDA, how actually should it handle this fact that all these countries are now crossing the threshold? Okay? Should it just stick firm to that rule? $1,200 above that, you're out? Or should that be modified? Because actually we never thought about this problem because it never really occurred in such a big way up to now. So those are the 3 questions that I want to pose in this, that I pose in the papers, and in this talk. So let me go back to the political debates. Okay? And this notion that if a country crosses a certain threshold, aid should cease, or at least be curtailed severely. And actually, there are 2 types of reasoning for this. Okay? One is that there is still global responsibility to help the poor in those countries, but the fact that that country has crossed this threshold and still has poor people tells you how productive your aid is going to be in helping poor people in that country. Yeah? So the country itself now has the resources, and it is not helping its poor because there's still a lot of poor people. How do you think your aid is going to help? Yeah? Let me just finish this, then I'll come to you. The second one is simply that the moral responsibility ends, period. The first argument is an instrumental argument. You still want to help. It's just that that's an indicator that this mechanism may not be the right one to use. The second argument is a more powerful argument, I would say, which is, no, you've crossed the threshold. Thank you very much. There is no responsibility. End of story. End of. Okay. Yeah, you had a question.
Because is it too much, or?
Well, I'm going to come to the numbers, but the whole of IDA works in 3-year cycles. Okay? It has it's called 3-year replenishment period. And for each 3-year period, it's $45 billion. It's for a 3-year period. So the annual flow of IDA is roughly $15 billion a year. Okay?
India receives, or in comparison to the number?
So India's IDA flow would be of the order of $2 billion a year. Okay? Yes.
Yes. Are there differences in the purposes for giving aid than the purposes for receiving aid?
So there are certainly different purposes for giving aid. And there's a big discussion on whether you have this objective or that objective, etc. Whether they differ from the purpose of receiving aid is an interesting question, which I hadn't. I will talk about this when I talk about Indian views on receiving aid. I'm going to talk about what Indian views are on this thing and how they've evolved in the last 5-7 years. So maybe we can discuss that then. Yes, another question. Yes, please.
About situations where countries use aid as a political tool as well, right? So to kind of gain influence in Africa or
yeah. So there's a big discussion on this also in the literature as to whether in fact the objective of aid is poverty reduction or not. And that's right, and we'll come to those discussions as well. And that links into questions of conditionality on aid, whether you have political conditionality or not, and so on. So this last issue, the second line of reasoning, actually relates very closely to a very lively debate in political philosophy. And that's what I want to, that's sort of when I was engaged in this down and dirty discussion, it became clear to me that the discussions were actually quite closely related to a very, very lively debate, current debate in political philosophy. And an extreme position on one side of this debate is that there is no moral responsibility, no obligation on justice-based arguments of those in one nation state to help the poor in another. Let me just consider this debate. And I want to start with talking about roles. Now, as I'm sure all of you know, a very powerful line of argument in political philosophy is the Rawlsian contractarian line of argument. And a powerful line of argument in debate has been, if you like, the globalization of roles, the application of roles to the global arena. And people like Thomas Pogge and Charlie Bites and others have pushed this as their main work over the last few years. First of all, I want you to recall the simplified Rawlsian maximin. Okay? Alternative proposals for constitutions are put forward, and the assumption is that society makes a choice, individuals make a choice, behind this veil of ignorance. You don't know what your position is going to be, and you're asked to choose between different ways of organizing society. And the Rawlsian argument is that this behind the veil of ignorance has a special claim on our moral intuitions. That which would appear intuitively right to you from behind the veil of ignorance, so that you don't know your position, and you're choosing between different orderings of society, has a special claim, would be the Rawlsian argument. And that was the Rawls's innovation. And furthermore, it's argued that from behind the veil of ignorance, individuals would choose that arrangement which would focus on the well-being of the worst-off individuals, the famous Rawlsian maxi-min. And if you want a general statement, it's there but for the grace of God go I, is what people are meant to be thinking behind this veil of ignorance to say, I will choose maxi-min. That's the argument. I'm not saying I necessarily support it. I'm saying that is the Rawlsian basic argument. And applying this same argument to the global arena, you can think the global citizens are all behind the veil of ignorance. What arrangement would they choose? And that's a translation, would be you'd focus on the poorest of the poor in the world, no matter where they existed. The fact that they were in this nation state or that nation state would be irrelevant in this line of argument. In the globalized Rawlsian view, where there'd be every individual would be behind this global veil of ignorance, and you'd be thinking, what should I do? And of course, I don't want to go into the details of Rawlsian maximin either, okay? I mean, there are many, many issues with this. When Arrow introduced this to economists, he pointed out precisely that there's a very high degree of implied risk aversion if you go for the maximin argument, and so on. But what I want to focus on is a criticism of global Rawlsian maximin, which focuses not so much on the maximin part, but on the global part. In other words, globalizing Rawls. And it may perhaps surprise you to know that the major critic of global Rawlsianism is Rawls himself. In a series of arguments which culminated in a book called The Law of Peoples, which is his second book. Everybody knows about The Theory of Justice, which is the first book. Fewer people know about The Law of Peoples, where this series of arguments were developed by Rawls. And essentially, let me summarize it for you. It's the following. He says, my argument, Rawls's argument, is based on contractarian theories of justice, okay, which evolved from essentially Hobbesian arguments. And for Hobbesian Leviathan-type arguments, you need a prior, which is that actually there is a sovereign and a subject. It's once you have a sovereign and a subject, and there's a contract which says you are the sovereign, I am the subject, that you then begin to work out what are the contours of that contract. And you can use Rawlsian theory of justice to say the contours of the social contract should be like this, this, or this. That the morally intuitive way of arranging things is to focus on the poorest of the poor. Rawls's argument is that such a frame exists, however imperfectly, for the nation state. It does not exist at the global level. That is the nature of the argument. So let me finish this, and then this slide and the next one, then I'll come to you, yeah? So just to repeat what I said, but in much nicer words, here's Thomas Nagel's summary of this position. He says, the liberal requirements of justice include a strong component of equality among citizens. But that applies to the basic structure of a unified nation state. It does not, for example, apply to the personal choices of individuals living in such a society, because that's a different philosophical argument for that. Nor does it apply to the relations between one society and another society, or between members of different societies, because you need the sovereign and the subject defined in order for the Rawlsian argument to have traction. That's Rawls's argument. It says you can use whatever argument you want, you can't use my argument for this. Egalitarian justice is a requirement of the internal political, economic, and social structures of nation states and cannot be extrapolated to different contexts. And Nagel, actually, is well known as a proponent of the Rawlsian position, and this is his summary of that, of the Rawlsian position of the law of peoples. Okay? And this is what Nagel calls a political conception. The alternative conception, which he calls cosmopolitanism, flows from the basis of equal concern and duty that is owed to all human beings. And here's again Nagel's summary. Now, Nagel doesn't support this, but I think it's a good summary. And when I finish this, I'll come to your question. Okay? And here's the alternative position. It would be morally inconsistent not to wish, for the world as a whole, a common system of institutions that could attempt to realize the same standards of fairness that one wants for one's own society. The accident of being born in a poor rather than a rich country is as arbitrary a determinant of one's fate as the accident of being born into a poor rather than a rich family in the same country. And this is the view that Poge and Beitz and Singer and so on have developed in this global Rawlsianism to globalize Rawls, which was resisted by Rawls himself, as we argued. Yes, let me.
Prior to the Hobbesian argument, is to have a sovereign in a society already existing. I thought that the idea was that you have a society, they're in a state of nature, and the solution is to elect a sovereign, choose a sovereign. Yeah. So the sovereign is constructed.
But it's only after that. So this is, we're now talking about the detail of the contract between the sovereign and the subject. And you need that framework, is the argument, okay? And the question is, do we have that framework in a global setting? That's a... Yes, exactly. And that is Rawls's argument. Okay, now, as you'll see, I'm actually not sympathetic to the Rawls argument. I'm just laying the thing out in this way. Okay. Now, I should say, I'm skimming the surface of this. There are many, many elements to this debate between Rawls and the global Rawlsians. Okay? I've mentioned various things here. One, let me just mention, is Rawls's critique of monism. Okay? So one line is, people say, yeah, you're using this argument at the level of the state. Isn't it inconsistent for you not to use this when I go to the global level? Whatever obligate, isn't it inconsistent to do this? And Rawls sort of calls this monism. And his argument is that, no, you can indeed have different regulative principles at different levels. And there you go, a high philosophical phrase from Rawls: the correct regulative principle for a thing depends on the nature of that thing. And then there's also all sorts of things about, now, in the global Rawlsian setting, you can have not individuals behind the veil of ignorance, you can have nations behind the veil of ignorance, right? And what follows from that and so on. But it's a very nuanced argument, but I just want to mention that too. And what I want to note is that Rawls's reluctance, in fact resistance to global Rawlsianism, has echoes in these raw political sentiments in the north that I mentioned to you. Okay? They should look after their own poor now. They have enough resources. Why come to us? Okay? Not that there are poor there, ergo it is my responsibility to help. But they now have that nation, that collectivity now has the resources. Therefore, that diminishes my responsibility to help the poor in that. Of course, the political debates that I've been involved in town halls and so on, that's not quite how it's presented. It's a waste of money giving money to these people. That's that type of one. Now let me, yeah. So again, let me just, so there are two, again, remember there are two strands to this, okay? One is that if we give them money, they'll only spend it on spaceships and arms. That's an instrumental sort of view. The other is we no longer have any responsibility. And one has to distinguish between those two types of arguments. Now, I have to say that I myself am drawn to the cosmopolitan position, and I've written in detail about this sort of thing. And in the political arguments that I've been involved with, I argue along these lines in the global political debates. But I have to say that sometimes my own cosmopolitanism draws me up short. I have to sort of think, and there are three points that really raise questions in my mind about cosmopolitanism. Okay, so I take that position. I've argued along it, and you see, in small ways, we've won some victories. But let me raise some questions about that position, my own position. First is the supporters of cosmopolitanism, I notice, this is not a scientific survey that I've done, this is very anecdotal. I notice are, by and large, the cosmopolitan elite. Okay? It's actually people like us who go around the world, conferences and so on, and etc. Ordinary people, if I can use that word and distinguish them from us, are more likely to feel a connection to the political conception. Okay? And to somehow poo-poo and dismiss the lady who volunteers in the Oxfam shop in London and feel somewhat uncomfortable about giving money to a country which is itself now giving aid to another country, I think what she's doing is expressing a form of the political conception in this regard. Secondly, let me put this to you. Globally, if you were truly cosmopolitanism, it wouldn't matter where poverty was reduced. It really, truly wouldn't matter to you where poverty was reduced. And I want to link this to the MDG discussion, the Millennium Development Goals discussion. Okay? As you know, the first MDG is halving the incidence of poverty between 1990 and 2015. That's the first target, halving the global incidence of poverty. Well, that's already happened, actually. And because it's happened in China, and it's happened in India. Once you set a global target, it's basically determined by what happens in India and China. But poverty in some parts of Africa has actually risen. Not in the last 5 to 7 years, but before that it was actually rising. How do we feel about that? In some sense, a genuine cosmopolitan would feel no qualms about that at all. In other words, a given degree of poverty reduction, it wouldn't matter to you how it was distributed around the world. But if it matters to you, and in some of my waking moments, it does matter to me. So I have been arguing that these global targets are too global, that we should be going down to Africa-level targets and country-level targets and Ghana-level targets, and within Ghana, between the north of the country and the south of the country, and so on. And that gives me pause to question my own cosmopolitanism. And let me try the third argument as well, where some of my work, I've sort of questioned myself on this thing. You know, even within a country, the same issue arises. When you're in a federalist structure, similar sorts of questions arise. And I want to give you an example of this from Malaysia, work that Sudhir Anand and I did on Malaysia many years ago. See, like many countries, India is no exception, like many countries with a federal structure or a state structure, there's a big problem of center-state allocations. How do you allocate central funds to the provinces, back to the provinces? In India, it's something called the Finance Commission. In South Africa, it's the Fiscal Finance Commission, and whatever. Every country has one of these things where they worry about these things. The question is, what should be in the formula which allocates central funds to the states? Well, some measure of need, And what should be that measure of need? Well, one candidate is the percentage of people in poverty in that state, the poverty indicator of that state. Well, a very interesting conflict arose in Malaysia between two states, Johor and Kedah. Kedah is a small state in the north of the country, which has a very small population, but a very high incidence of poverty. Johor is a large state in the south of the country, with a smaller incidence of poverty, smaller fraction poor, but a larger total population. So actually, the poverty rate is higher in Kedah than in Johor, but there are more Johorians who are poor than Kedahians who are poor. And as you might imagine, Johor argued that it should be the fraction of the total national poor who live in Johor that should be in the formula, and Kedah argued it should be the fraction of each state's population that is poor that should be in the formula. How do you adjudicate between those two? Well, here's what Sudhiran and I argued, taking the cosmopolitan perspective and taking instrumental. We said, look, suppose our objective is in fact to reduce poverty no matter where it occurred nationally. It all depends upon what you think is going to happen to this money. If you think the money is essentially going to be randomly thrown at the population, you have no trust whatsoever in the government actually targeting this to the poor. You can think of the money as you take each dollar and you throw it randomly. The money that goes to Kedah is thrown randomly at the Kedah population. The money that goes to Johor is thrown randomly at the Johor population. And you are interested in the probability that it hits a poor person, no matter whether they live in Johor or Kedah. But the probability is higher in Kedah, where the percentage of poor is higher. You can do all this formally, mathematically, and so on and so forth. I'm just giving you the intuitive stuff. So that's one view. The second view, if you'd really trust the governments that the money goes to the poorest, to the poor in each country, then of course you can be sure that a dollar that's given to Johor will go to Johor poor, a dollar that goes to Kedah will go to Kedah poor. In some sense, you're indifferent. If you're genuinely cosmopolitan, you're indifferent. And then you might as well take a population. You might as well say, okay, I'm going to give it money in proportion to the poor in Johor and Kedah. So really, it turns out to be your view on how well the state governments do in spending that money, even though your objective is cosmopolitan as a whole, which is you want to minimize national poverty no matter where it occurs. So we made this argument, and we said, the incidence, we don't have faith in the governments to target this thing, so the incidence of poverty should be what goes in the formula. Of course, it was a political compromise, so both elements went in and so on. But what was interesting was Kedah's reaction. They were, of course, very pleased that we were supporting their argument. They thank you very much. But they said, no, our argument is something somewhat different. Poverty is such a fundamental thing that our weight should be 1, the same as Johor's weight should be 1. In the same way that the US states send 2 senators to the Senate, irrespective of the population size, the same way that the Sultanate of Malaysia rotates around the states, each sultan of each state, it rotates around, not in proportion to the population size, but because when we federated as one. Okay? That's a very different argument from the cosmopolitan argument, okay? And that sort of brought me up sharp as well. Anyway, those are just some questions that I raised for myself, but I have these. So let me then turn to a somewhat more technical discussion. So let's take this cosmopolitan perspective. Suppose our objective is to minimize global poverty, no matter where it occurs. Can it be that in such a situation, it can make analytical sense for a country to be both a donor and a recipient of aid? Okay. So, consider a model with 3 countries, a high-income country, a middle-income country, and a low-income country. Each of these can, if it so wishes, dispense aid to other countries, any of the other countries, okay? So each country makes its decision on how much to give. Obviously, that amount depends upon what its objectives are, what its instruments are, and, of course, the level and direction of aid from all other countries as well. Taking all those as given, this country will decide it's optimal. And we can then solve for a Nash equilibrium of aid allocations across these different countries. The question is whether in that equilibrium it could be possible for a country to be both a recipient of aid and a donor of aid. Well, I raise this question to you. I haven't fully solved this thing, but I think it's an interesting question for somebody to think through. But here's some finger exercises. Suppose all countries have the same instruments, the same objective, and let's say the objective of each country is the global Rawlsian maximin. They want to improve the well-being of the poorest of the poor no matter where in the world they live. That's each country's objective function. Then if the world's poorest of the poor lived in the low-income country, there would be no country which was both a donor and a recipient. It would all be flowing to the low-income country. Yeah? That's your objective. But that's just a benchmark. Of course, this result would not necessarily hold if, one, the world's poorest lived in some of them in mix as well, and that's an empirical question. And it indeed turns out to be the case. The world's poorest some of the world's poorest live in mix. There's a very interesting empirical finding in the last few years. 20 years ago, 90% of the world's poor lived in low-income countries. Those officially classified as low income, according to those criteria I gave you, 90% of the world's poor lived in those countries. Today, 3/4 of the world's poor live in middle-income countries. Of course, the poor haven't moved. They're where they are. It's the classification of the countries has changed because China has become a middle-income country, India has become a middle-income country, et cetera, et cetera. So, or indeed, if instruments available. Now, if instruments available were different across countries, then of course, again, you could have an equilibrium in which I take money from you for some things and I give money to you for something else. Indeed, The Economist was onto this, and recently, in a recent article, noted the following. Like trade, aid benefits from specialization and comparative advantage. Emerging countries with recent experience to draw upon might do a better job of infrastructure spending. The West should focus more on policies and good governance, something many poorer Indian states are crying out for. Now, whether you believe this or not, the notion that there's comparative advantage, that different countries may have different efficiencies in different instruments, that could also lead to an equilibrium whereby you have a country which is both a donor and a recipient of aid. So it's not just that India is receiving $2 billion from IDA and giving $5 billion to Africa. It's what are those things going to, which we should be also thinking about is what emerges out of this. Yeah. So analytically, it is indeed not irrational or incoherent for a country to be a donor and a recipient of aid. Unfortunately, this argument doesn't go across very well in town halls, okay? The donor-recipient argument, the country being a donor and a recipient is a killer argument in the political domain. I'm afraid that's just the case, okay? There's no way that I can convince. Their eyes glaze over when it's particularly so for northern publics with bilateral aid, which I think was being their own money going directly to whatever. It may be less so for multilateral aid, and I now want to turn to some of the operational dimensions for multilateral aid, in particular IDA. So I'm sort of coming towards the end of this thing now, okay? Now, as I said to you, IDA dispenses about $45 billion a year. The current cutoff is $1,200 per capita. Now, there are other considerations and so on, which I won't go into. There's a lot of operational and administrative detail here. But I want to focus on the GNI per capita criterion. And here's the condition, here's the criterion on inflows. The borrower will continue to access IDA resources on regular terms until the GNI per capita continuously exceeds the cutoff for 3 years. That's taken from the administrative manual of IDA. And India has now satisfied that condition. There's actually a second thing which a lot of people don't appreciate, the so-called accelerated repayment clause, which is that when this cutoff has been, when you're over this thing and you quote-unquote graduated, not only is it that you don't receive any money, but the terms on your outstanding stock of debt hardens by a factor of 2. Okay? So whatever principal was due on December 31st of this year, twice as much will be due from the outstanding debt that has the repayment terms basically The maturity period is shortened by a factor of 2. And you know, this is what's really getting countries, okay? And they didn't realize it. And now there's 10 years left of that debt that was taken for, these are 40-year loans, roughly speaking 40-year loans, okay? So you took something 20 years ago, and it's there that, but all of us, that if you graduate, then you will have to whatever and so on. But you know, 20 years ago, nobody was thinking of this. And now, India, Vietnam, Ghana, and so on, all these countries are facing this thing. And actually, the Indian case is quite interesting, because as you may know, in the Indian case, a lot of the action is in the states, and a lot of the World Bank lending is what's known as back-to-back lending. In other words, the check goes from the World Bank to the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Finance then writes a check to the government of Orissa, let's say. And although it's sovereign lending, so formally the government of India is responsible for it, the way the government of India sees it in terms of its internal rules, government of Orissa has to pay back that money to the Ministry of Finance. It will then pay the repayment to them. So actually, it's not the repayment terms of the government of India which have hardened by a factor of 2. It's the government repayment terms of the government of Orissa which have hardened by a factor of 2. Okay? And if it so happens that the government in a state whose terms of for whom this is a particularly hard thing has a stranglehold on you in the center in terms of coalition politics, then you can sort of imagine how these things will flow in terms of the position that India takes vis-a-vis IDA, hardening, softening, and so on. Okay, well, here are some IDA graduates. Chile, Korea, Thailand, China, Indonesia, Montenegro. And you know, the course of development, like the course of true love, doesn't run smooth. So here are some reverse graduates. Those countries which graduated with great fanfare and then fell back again. The last one, Zimbabwe, of course, we know the tragedy of Zimbabwe. And Moss and Leo have done some very interesting simulations where they've run this movie forward. We use the standard IMF growth projections, etc., run it forward, and see which countries are going to graduate and what's going to happen. Well, here's what's going to happen. This was done a few years ago, and some of it is already out of date, but you know. Now, as I said, IDA is run by 3-year replenishment cycles, and they're numbered. So IDA 16 is a 3-year period. We're currently in IDA 16, coming to the end of IDA 16. 16 times 3, so IDA is roughly 48 years old, okay, 50 years old. We're going into IDA 17 now, okay? And all these countries will fall off the cliff. Will in fact, quote unquote, graduate. Here's India. Okay. Then you run the movie forward another 3 years, another 5 years. Look, all these countries, Ghana, Nicaragua, Pakistan, Senegal, all these countries are going to be falling off the cliff. So if you run this movie forward for 15 years or so, for 10 years, 15 years or so, what will it look like? I just want you to focus on the second bullet, which is that the fund which was created, the global fund which was created to engage with the world's poor, will be disengaged from the bulk of the world's poor. Because they will now live in countries which have graduated according to the old criterion. The issue didn't matter 20 years ago. It was just some sort of a criterion way out there, you know, and then, you know, Korea, yeah, well, that's fine, you know, whatever. Now, all these countries are coming up at the same time. It's a big issue. It's a big issue. Now, actually, the politics of this are quite interesting. Because if I'm one of the countries that will not graduate, that I'm left over, I'm actually very happy. Thank you very much, India. Goodbye. Because your money will now come to me. The donors are quite happy about this because they can declare victory and walk away. Okay? They can say, that's it. You know, our objective was to do this. Graduated. You graduated. Thank you. We're now going to cut by half our assistance to IDA. Okay? So the northern politics, especially with this optic that, you know, they should help their own poor, etc., are pretty dicey. The southern politics are not too clear either, okay? Because for many African countries, this is their chance to get the bonanza. And what I've been arguing with my African friends is just look at how many African countries are going to be graduating pretty soon. You may win the short-term thing, but you're going to start losing pretty quickly unless you do something about changing these rules. That's what we should all be thinking about, if indeed that's the objective. Okay. Oh. I don't know what's going on here. So what's the answer? What's the answer? Many of us have been, this is where the down and dirty argument of the negotiations and so on sort of comes in. Many of us have been arguing along the following frame, is to have basically three windows of IDA. One is a conventional window, which is for countries below $1,200 per capita. The second window is for countries below, let's say, twice or three times that cutoff. They will continue to have access, but since the argument for continuing support is that there are pockets of poverty in these countries, even though they have now crossed, on average, the international poverty line, these funds should be targeted directly towards poverty sectors, poverty regions, poor regions, and poverty-oriented sectors. Not generalized, but targeted towards these sectors. Yes?
The income is not the same as poverty reduction, so why not have a target either be basically...
Thank you. That's a good question. The question is, if your big thing is that this income criterion is all wrong, why not have the criterion that you want in there? Two things. Firstly, is sort of more of a political thing, which is that the income frame is pretty much set, okay? It would take a long line of argument to dislodge that. And we were trying to get a result within the current frame. So this was the argument for that. But the second thing, the issue, I think, would arise even if you put the poverty criterion in, because there would be a cutoff, countries would cross over, and the poor would still be in the countries where you had crossed that threshold, okay? So in a sense, the fundamental issue is the issue that we pose in the title of one of our papers, poor countries or poor people, question mark. But that would require such a massive reorientation of this thing that we merely pose the issue, because the entire architecture is dependent upon these nation-state linkages. And within that frame, we're trying to change these things. Now, I don't need to tell you that, maybe the whole series of operational problems if you go this route, if you go our route of having the second window and so on and so forth. What about countries which graduated 5 years ago and are now in that second window? Are they going to go back in, or what? Is China going to go back in? And so on. Okay, that's why I made it twice, not three times. Okay, if you make it three times, China is in. If you make it twice, China is out, and you can immediately see where the politics of this thing is going to come in. How exactly do we define the poor regions or poverty-focused sectors for the second window? How much to be allocated to the second window compared to the first window? And how exactly will performance criteria differ in the second window from the first window, and so on? These are all operational questions. When you can't just say we're going to open the second window, you have to actually design the mechanism through which these things are they're actually operationalized. But my point is, and I'm happy to discuss those, but these operational questions only become relevant when the higher level decision has been taken to continue concessional assistance to mix beyond the IDA cutoff. So what's the outcome? So let me take the case of India and IDA and tell you what the outcome has been. So I mentioned that there are these donor concerns about political optics, which are on the one hand the manifest needs in India, and secondly, so there's that the political optics about their citizens saying why we're giving money to this country, versus the more analytically oriented policy type saying, yeah, actually there is a need in these countries. What's happened in India is some very interesting changes in position. So let me tell you how that has evolved. In the mid-2000s, when there was we were in the middle of this go-go period and growth was high and everything was whatever, the view was, yeah, we will graduate. The finance minister apparently personally minuted, saying when time comes to graduate, we will graduate gracefully from IDA, was the thing. We will not try to stay in, we will not try to whatever, it was saying. Well, that was 2005, okay? 2008, we had Lehman Brothers. 2009, we have an election. That finance minister is moved from the finance ministry to the home ministry following the attacks in Mumbai. A more pragmatic finance minister comes in, should we say. That's Pranab Mukherjee, who's now the president of India. So the ship of state now moves from having been set towards graduation, thank you very much, bye-bye, to can we stay in? How can we stay in? So people like yours truly, whose papers had been poo-pooed before this time, suddenly start getting phone calls about, how can we let's have a discussion about this and so on. Well, last year, this pragmatic finance minister, Pranab Mukherjee, goes on to become the president of India. And the old finance minister, who had minuted whatever, Chidambaram, comes back as a finance minister. Okay. So, tremendous nervousness amongst the civil servants. Am I now going to have to turn the ship of state back in this direction? No, but Chidambaram is a pragmatist, as anybody knows, and these are different and difficult times. 2012, 2013, financial crunch, fiscal crunch, election coming up, etc. A couple of $1 billion comes in very helpful indeed in this thing. So that strategy was maintained as a practical negotiating matter. The final outcome of this is still being negotiated, but it's now clear. In fact, the final meeting of the preparation for IDA 17 was held in December. We're now into IDA 17, the 3 years of IDA 17, and India will stay on in IDA for the IDA 17 period. So it's not a general generic change. It's for and since IDA always works in these 3-year cycles, for the next 3-year cycle, India will stay in, but on hardened terms, on slightly hardened terms. So it seems to me that we have gone from both on the donor side, wanting graduation, and on the Indian side, wanting graduation for different reasons. This goes back to your point about receiving aid and giving aid, to a situation where there's recognition that merely because India has crossed this threshold doesn't mean that there aren't these needs, poverty-focused needs, and that there is some argument for continuing this assistance beyond. We're happy to have got this. It's very untidy. It's still not clear how exactly it's going to play out. But the high-level thing that India will stay on has indeed been accomplished. Okay. Otherwise, the way I would put it is that in some sense, caught between the skepticism of the northern tax-paying public and the gung-hoism of the Indian elite, the Indian poor would lose out on this particular source of funds for development. So let me summarize. Aid to mix is a live political issue. The politics is relatively clear and straightforward. But what about the analytics? The philosophical doctrine of cosmopolitanism can indeed be used to underpin aid in a non-poor country. But if we accept this doctrine, then a major operational issue is whether and how you modify the graduation rules of IDA. And that's sort of a practical thing that many of us have been working on. But the roles of the law of peoples stands against the globalization of roles-in arguments in a theory of justice. And in fact, in the extreme form of this, the roles-in argument is held to operate only within each nation state. And this philosophical argument, and this to me was the most interesting linkage that I found in this thing, has an echo in the northern streets, that they should now look after their own poor. And in this political optic, a recipient country which has its own aid program provides a killer argument to shut down aid to such countries. And we add to this the self-image of the elite in the middle-income countries, which finds it demeaning to accept aid, despite the fact that there's poverty in their countries. So, the final bullet. Can a country be a donor and a recipient of aid? Answer, analytically, it surely can, but politically, despite the success in IDA, I think it's a short-run success, it may not be allowed to do so. Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, just to kind of motivate a little bit what I had said earlier. I mean, it seems perfectly consistent to have India's foreign aid program, I have to presume, is primarily geopolitically motivated, right? So, I mean, a lot of the reasons countries give aid is for geopolitical reasons.
Yeah.
A lot of the reasons countries accept aid is outcome, poverty reduction or what have you. I mean, it just, so I don't think that changes the fundamental political problem that you have, right, especially in the Northern Republic. But I do think, at least conceptually, the kind of spending that India is doing is foreign ministry spending on some level. It's diplomatic objectives. No one says that the U.S. should get rid of its sort of diplomatic objectives or pursue other things. I mean, I think it can be perfectly consistent to have the two things going on at the same time. And then the other thing is just more of a political question, which is, it seems, from what you're describing, it seems immensely difficult to change some of these IDA provisions. Why not just sort of improve poverty alleviation programs in IBRD or one of the other branches of the bank?
Sure. Okay, so the first question is in terms of India, yeah. Now, we can take the aid program of any country and discuss it in detail. And in the case of India and China and so on, it's very much, I think, politically motivated. And again, as some of you know, India and China are currently playing a great game. A great game is being played in Africa with Indian and Chinese money. China's sort of winning hands down. But the Indians are in there batting, gamely, and they're... and it's exactly linked very much to that, and linked to the seat of the UN Security Council and so on. So that's perfectly fine. But it's analytically an interesting question, nevertheless. Suppose, in fact, the objective was poverty reduction. Would it then still make sense to have this sort of an equilibrium? I think that's an interesting analytical question, and that's why I pose that question in that way. The politics of it is relatively clear. Then you ask the question about IBRD and IDA. This is again, so India is a recipient of both IBRD and IDA. Okay? India is what's known as a blend country. It receives both. It's not neither one nor the other. And the question now is how to. The question was whether IDA should stop completely, and IBRD should continue as being the main source. So one of these presentations called India, IBRD, and IDA takes on board the IBRD question as well. So let me explain. Let me talk about some of those issues. There's in many countries which have been blend, like India or Brazil and so on. Which have been in the past blend. An IBRD/IDA mindset develops, which is soft money for the soft sectors, hard money for the hard sectors. Okay. So there's a tremendous reluctance on the part of the government to use IBRD money for social sectors. And this is another thing that I've been warning about in these discussions, okay? Which is you're going to come to a point where this money is going to dry up. And yet these needs in the social sectors are still going to be present. And when you look at Brazil, which has been hard money for the last 10 years, 15 years, they don't think of it in terms of hard versus soft. It's IBRD money, and they allocate according to whatever. So, but it takes 5-7 years to change this mindset. So that's one of them. And the battle of the issue and the issue of how to use IBRD funding is a long-standing one, which I can. Yeah, please.
Trying to better understand the dynamic forces. I'm trying to understand the dynamic forces at play here. Historically, can you give some examples? Do countries that are recipients then later graduate, do they end up becoming donors, or are they too busy paying off interest?
Yeah. So there are two or three very famous examples. Okay, Japan is perhaps one of the most famous examples. The Japanese bullet train was financed through World Bank lending, and of course it obviously paid all that off and so on. The next example is Korea, which graduated from IDA in 1961, from IBRD I don't know when, and then it's now a member of OECD, and now it actually is developing quite a vibrant aid program. Although interestingly, for aspects of its assistance, India is out of the net.
So I'm curious how long of a lag it takes before those countries can pay off sufficient amount of debt to become donors.
Yeah, it varies. I mean, again, that's why I was giving the example of Japan. I suppose Japan, the Japanese, the Tokyo Olympics were in 1964, which is what the bullet trade, et cetera, was built for. And I don't have the figures right in my head, but I would say that it was round about the early 80s that Japan finally paid off its debt. But it was already doing assistance at that time already.
So it seems there may be a role in your future policy mechanisms for debt forgiveness as an alternative policy or a substitute policy. It seems like there's a dimension there that's yet to be explored, at least in this topic.
No, there's a very big discussion of debt relief and so on, and of course we then run into classic sort of debates on moral hazard issues versus overhang type issues and so on. And many of us went through this in the context of African debt, and of course Latin American debt in the 1980s and African debt in the 1990s. At that time, for example, I took the view that the overhang argument dominated the moral hazard argument, okay. so that there should indeed be debt forgiveness for African countries at that time. So one can balance out those considerations. Sure. Another question? Yeah. Yes.
The Volcker shock of 1979 and 1982 would be unintended. So a lot of the structural adjustment programs that the IMF imposed in the 80s and beyond, and the revamped role of the IMF and the World Bank had a lot to do with the new terms and new conditions and the new roles played by the IMF and the World Bank as well in terms of debt collecting. So where is the, so it's not clear to me at all as to what, it was not clear to me and it's still not clear to me as to how these aid mechanisms function in the context of large accumulations of debts.
One point I would make is that we're not there now. That's one thing. All that has washed out. We're now in a different type of debt situation, but we're not in the official debt overhang issue that we had in the 1980s for Latin America and the 1990s for Africa. That's actually been, the Africa one has actually been taken care of by the heavily indebted poor countries debt relief initiative. The debt issues that we now have are more to do with private sector related debt turning into sovereign debt and so on. So I don't think we're in the same game, at least that would be my reading. I mean, we can have a long discussion about the 80s, but I'm not sure this is the right, I'm happy to do that, but I'm not sure this is the right time or place for that. Yes?
Question or comment.
Sure.
Wouldn't it be that the giving of aid while still needing aid, the giving of aid is the sort of, creating a kind of rapport with the countries you're giving aid. They say you spend money to make money. So when you're giving aid, you're actually spending money to create a kind of relationship so that you can make more money from it eventually. And then at that same time, because I don't really believe aid is free, but then at that same time, you actually do need help yourself. So it'll be like the case of a man who probably can't eat 3 square meals and he's sharing his meals with other people just because he's looking at the future where, this person makes it and I also make it from there.
Yeah, so again, this goes back a little bit links to your point about the different the objectives of aid in this context. And many of us, myself including, have criticized bilateral aid in the past for this type of close links to domestic business and so on. Okay? In fact, over the years, I would say that paradoxically, Western aid has become better in this regard, precisely because of these criticisms, precisely because their parliaments were then looking at their ministries and saying, how can you justify this as aid when actually it's this helicopter firm which is being whatever and so on. The big problem now is not just those countries. The big problem are the Indias and the Chinas who have not been subjected to the last 20 years of scrutiny by their civil society on their aid. So the biggest business aid links are now actually Brazilian aid, Indian aid, Chinese aid, and so on, just now. So I want to in some sense, give some marks to Western donors on that, bilateral donors on that front. My second point is that what I was discussing in the IDA context was actually multilateral development assistance, which is a slightly different kettle of fish. So it's not that, this country's businesses are getting a benefit, because if they do, then that other country will complain. It's a multilateral thing, so it's sort of a mutually assured balance in that. Yes?
Donor was in bilateral aid. Is it also contributing to multilateral?
Okay, so this is now, the short answer is the bulk of it, no. It's all multiple is bilateral. But there's a big debate going on within India just now about whether, so one of the things at the top that the first faction was saying is we should become donors to IDA now, okay? Instead of receiving $2 billion, let us find some money from somewhere and give $2 billion to IDA so we can get a seat at the table as donors. Now, wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be neat, okay? We have 400 million poor people, but wouldn't that be neat for us to sit as donors in this setting? And that's playing out in small ways in terms of Asian Development Bank, Asian Development Fund, Africa Development Bank, again, because of this Africa thing. India is a contributor to the Africa Development Fund because it gives you a seat at the table in these settings. Yes?
Nah, it's okay. But what about like the domestic political economy doing most of this work? So let me give you two ideas for so let's suppose like the median voter in each country thinks their own poor is lazy, but thinks the poor of some other country is unlucky. And then in which case, like, middle classes of every country will want to contribute to the countries below them. And so you'll get that you'll be a net recipient from the rich country and a contributor to the countries below you. So that's one model. And then the other one is potentially that like domestic NGO sectors that are in fact mobilized to capture aid and use it to fund their own activities might exactly be moving to might exactly replicate this pattern where they sort of want to target and lobby for aid to the next country poorer down, and that's sort of the way that they can effectively mobilize those resources. And so it's like constituencies at home that are driving the pressures for
yeah, I think again these are very valid points. So the first one, where effectively this country's objective function, because it's an objective function of median voter, in other words, it's the objective function of the country, is in fact to care, let's say, to care more about the poor in another country. Or you don't really need to go that far. You can say that suppose our objective is Rawlsian maximin, and it so happens that the poorest of the poor live in that country. Then it would be perfectly consistent. Okay? And then you can see if different countries have different objective functions, okay, then you could indeed get this cycle whereby I give to you because I care about the poorest of the poor, but you give to me because you don't care about the poorest of the poor, you care about somewhere in the middle of the distribution, so I get it, and so on. So one can generate that without necessarily going to the median voter type setting, but that's fair enough. The NGO thing is, again, very, very interesting. Okay? So the domestic political economy of aid giving is also actually quite fascinating. And one of the say in the UK context, the phrase that's used by the anti-aid groups is the aid industry. Okay, is the aid industry. So this includes the consultants, it includes whatever, it includes the NGOs, etc. So the notion that they're pushing for certain types of argument in this, where I've used this type of analysis is in the context of how is it that different international organizations get their different objective functions. And actually, I came across this in the context of Ghana, where as the head of the World Bank's Ghana office, I would chair the meeting of all the donors. So there was the UNDP, there was the European Union, there was the FAO, there was the whatever. And the British taxpayer was represented, and including the British bilateral program. The British taxpayer was represented 7 times around this table. Obviously the World Bank the British directly, and then the FAO, the UNDP, and so on and so forth. And we were all fighting against each other, saying our objectives are very different. So how does one make sense of that sort of an outcome is an interesting question that I thought to myself as I was sitting there in that context. Well, there are different ways in which one can think of this. Okay? You can say, well, in fact, the polity, or some sort of unified polity, is not entirely sure whether it's monetary prudence which wins the day, or whether it's investment in infrastructure which wins the day, or whether it's whatever that wins the day. So what I want to do then is to have a diversified portfolio. Okay? So fine. So I now put some of the eggs in this basket and the eggs in this. So that would be a benign way of thinking of this. Okay? The other way is, in fact, that there are unresolved issues within the domestic political economy. There's a monetarist argument and the whatever argument. And the way that is resolved is, of course, not internally, but through, essentially, it's an externalization of those debates. So the representative to the IMF is from the UK Treasury, the UK Finance Ministry. The representative to the World Bank is from the UK Ministry, from the Department of International Development, the UK Ministry of Aid. And so on. You see this all around in this thing. So in some sense, it's a reflection of those things. I think it's a very interesting point. Yes?
Cover this because I just imagine the angry Tea Party equivalent and your argument just flew out of my head. Can you just go over why again it is that the core argument of why it is again that India can and should be both the recipient
Yeah. Well, again, I find I've not been able to explain it to the angry Tea Party person, but let me do it as sort of fellow analysts in this setting. The simplest one is of comparative advantage of instruments. Okay? So the notion is that India might be better at building rural roads than the Brits. And so if Mali needs rural roads built, or it needs a particular type of buses on the roads, which have been tested on the roads between here and Kanyakumari, then India is the right country to do that. On the other hand, in terms of perhaps, again, institutions and so on, it may be that the Brits might be better. So that's the comparative advantage argument. Okay? And I think that's the one that comes closest to the possibility of succeeding with a general audience. The more general one is, as I said, suppose in fact countries have different objective, not instruments, but different objective functions. Okay? So I have a more I give more weight to the poorest of the poor than you do. That, in conjunction with the distribution of poverty around the world, can also lead to an equilibrium whereby you have a cycling of aid. Okay? You give to me because you think my poor are particularly deserving, and I give to you because I think your poor are particularly deserving, and so on. So that's a cycle. That argument I can't sell. That's an analytical, technical sort of argument. So those are the two main arguments. Yes?
Argument, and that is that bilateral aid is a part of foreign policy. And it's not that India would care more about the poorest of the poor than Mali.
You see, yeah, so again, so this is, for example, in the UK context, there's a huge debate. Okay? The UK, when the coalition government came in, set its target to the 0.7% of GDP as its aid target. And the history of the UK is very much linked to not trying to tie this to foreign policy, not trying to tie this into domestic business interests, but to poverty reduction. That's the UK case, I would say. Okay? Yeah. 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 Oh, okay. Well, Sweden. We're going to give you some more. Holland. Some more cases. The US is definitely not an exception to that. Not an exception. Yeah. No, they're not. No, that's right. But yeah, but you see, remember. So remember what my objective is. Remember my objective. My objective in this thing, my down and dirty policy objective in this thing, was to continue IDA for India in this, not just for India, I mean, to have a framework in which we can think about the continuation of IDA beyond this per capita income cutoff when the poverty in that country demands that. That is, if you like, the generic objective of this exercise. Okay? And in a general audience, to say, you know something, you're wrong about this business of a donor and whatever, because of course India is giving money for its own reasons to Africa. That'll in fact only strengthen the argument in the town hall. Say, yeah, so that's fine. So why then should we give money to their poor? Okay, that would be on par with they have a nuclear program, they have a space program. Therefore, let's cut back on the thing. So that would be my response to that. Yes.
I think sort of the combination of domestic interest group, regulatory capture, theory that's sort of relating certain agencies to certain constituencies within a country. I mean, it seems like that's sort of a promising analytical tool. I mean, I think that you see that also, there's different ministries in India that are concerned with, I study investment treaties. So there's certain ministries that are responsible for defending India when it is hit by a claim, and they want a lot of renegotiation of these treaties and defense clauses, and then you have India's overseas and sort of commercial agencies that realize that there's FDI from India in Tanzania or wherever, and let's have investment protection. So, I mean, this happens in every country around the world. I don't think it would ever make a Tea Party, it never can beat the Tea Party logic, which is pretty clean, right?
Yes.
But that's just the nature of governance.
So, in terms of the Indian thing again, different ministries, as you say, have already been giving aid. And there were two reasons to try and form this single agency, the Indian Aid Agency. One is that the MEA, the Ministry of External Affairs, the Foreign Ministry, wanted to get some bang for this buck rather than an uncoordinated way, because some bus manufacturer knows somebody in the Department of Trade and Industry and whatever, but why can't we tie this into upcoming UN votes? There's that type of an argument. The second actually is a more reasonable thing from the Ministry of Finance, which is, look, there's all this money going around, and we want some sort of a budgetary oversight on this and bring it to a single agency. Now there's a battle between the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as to where this agency will be located. You can imagine that sort of a battle. But the fact that an agency was being created, and that was what the Economist headline was. The Economist headline was, agency created, India creates agency to give aid to Africa. Okay? And then you had the discussion, does it make sense for this to happen? Okay. Yes?
Isn't it more a question of getting the right technical assistance from the right place? How do you tie it up with the source of aid? I mean, India is better off advising Africa on how to build rural roads. Why does the source of aid need to be India?
Oh, fair enough. That's a fair enough point. And many of us have made this argument in different contexts. Say, just give the country a check, and let them decide whether they want to buy Indian expertise or this expertise or that expertise and so on. That's certainly true, and one would make that argument. But much of, for example, Indian assistance is of that type, is of the sort of direct technical assistance type. Any other questions, comments?